Now, let's bring in the candidates. Republican challenger Ed Gillespie and the Democratic incumbent, Senator Mark Warner. And Mr. Gillespie, you won the toss. You get to begin with your 2-minute opening statement.
Well, Chuck, thank you. And Mark, it's good to be with you again and great to be with the chamber. I look forward to talking about my agenda for economic growth, which will be a new and better direction for us than the Obama-Warner policies. I want future generations to have the same opportunities that I've had. My grandfather's an immigrant janitor. My parents never went to college, and I got to be counselor to the President of the United States of America. But I fear that we're losing that kind of economic opportunity and upward mobility as a result of the Obama-Warner policies. And that's why I have put forward an economic growth plan, because the policies coming out of Washington today are squeezing hardworking Virginians between lost jobs, lower take-home pay, reduced working hours, and higher prices for health care, energy, and food. And they're making us less safe as a nation, less able to meet growing threats to our national security and to our public health and safety. That's why I would seek a seat on the Senate Armed Services Committee to restore our military and to stand up for our veterans. And I would also want to put forward these policies of mine that will create jobs, raise take-home pay, lift people out of poverty, hold down health care costs, and reduce energy prices. My policies will ease the squeeze on hardworking Virginians and make it easier for the unemployed to find work. And we need that in Virginia today. Under the Obama-Warner policies, for every net job created in Virginia, 2 people have gone onto food stamps. There are 65,000 more women living in poverty today, and 250,000 of us will have our health care plans canceled as a result of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, which the senator still supports. You know, under these Obama-Warner policies, the federal government is doing too many things that should be better left to the state and local governments and the private sector, and failing at too many things that it should be doing right. My policies will make things better. Thank you.
Senator Warner, your 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chuck, and it's good to see you, Ed. I'd also like to thank the Fairfax Chamber and all the Virginians who are watching tonight. It's been the greatest honor of my life to serve Virginia, first as governor and now as U.S. Senator. What brought me to public service was the notion that in America, everybody ought to get a fair shot. We can't guarantee you success, but you ought to get a fair shot. And if we're going to maintain that sense of opportunity in our country, we've got to have people in politics who are willing to work together. That's what I did as your governor. With a 2-to-1 Republican legislature, we turned a deficit into a surplus, and Virginia was named best managed state and the best state for business. I brought that same bipartisan approach to the Senate. That's why I'm so proud to have the support of the gentleman who held this office before me, Republican Senator John Warner, and why I'm so proud that I've got actually more former Republican legislators supporting me this campaign than when I first ran. In the Senate, I've worked on trying to take on the challenge of our debt and deficit, make sure veterans get the care they deserve, bringing jobs back to Virginia, and making sure young people aren't crushed by student debt. And you know what? On every major piece of legislation I work on, I start with a Republican partner. My opponent has a different approach. He spent his entire career as a D.C. lobbyist and a partisan political operative. He views every issue through what's in the best interest of the Republicans or Democrats. Matter of fact, he even went on TV and called himself a partisan warrior. His words, not mine. I got to tell you, the last thing Washington needs is another partisan warrior in either political party. In these challenging times, the world needs a strong America, economically, militarily, and morally. And to make that happen, America has to have leaders who can work together. Thank you.
And thank you, gentlemen, for both adhering to the time limits right at the beginning. Let's start with the news of the last 24 hours that's impacted a lot of Virginians here. Mr. Gillespie, you get the first question. I'll begin with you. And that, of course, is due to the Supreme Court's non-decision to review the case on gay marriage. It is now legal here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. You personally opposed gay marriage. Are you comfortable? Can you accept this decision by the Supreme Court not to act?
Well, let me make a couple of points, Chuck. I love people and respect them for who they are. I believe we are all created in the image and likeness of God. And as you noted, in my faith, marriage is between one man and one woman, and I believe that. As a senator, I believe it's the proper prerogative of the states to make these determinations, and I do not support a federal marriage amendment or federal policy in this regard. And the court has, as you said, ruled on this. It is the law in Virginia today, and as I do not believe that a federal law is the proper approach, then of course I accept the ruling of the decision by the Supreme Court not to take up this decision of the Circuit Court.
Senator Warner, you get time to respond.
On this issue, my opponent and I differ. I support marriage equality. I think it is appropriate that we live in a commonwealth that doesn't discriminate. It was something that I advocated as governor when I had the most diverse administrations in modern Virginia history. And I think back at those times, even back as early as the early 2000s, when companies across Virginia, including Capital One, where we're here tonight, said, we need to change these discriminatory practices against GLBT members of our community. So I think the Supreme Court did the right thing. I think they'll have to ultimately take this issue up. But again, on this issue, my opponent and I have very different opinions.
Mr. Gillespie, do you want to respond?
Well, again, as a matter of policy in the United States Senate, while we disagree in terms of whether or not marriage should be between one man and one woman, in terms of the role of a United States Senator, it's not something that I believe is an appropriate federal response, but again should be left to the states. And in terms of, by the way, people should not be discriminated against in terms of job discrimination based on sexual preference or sexual orientation. That was my policy as an employer in my 3 businesses that I ran.
10 years ago, you supported a federal constitutional amendment on marriage. Do you still support that?
Well, it was when I was chairman of the Republican National Committee, it was the platform called for a federal marriage amendment, and as chairman of the RNC, I stood for the platform. But as a United States Senator, I'm talking now about my policies and the policies that I would pursue as a United States Senator. And again, while I believe marriage is between one man and one woman, I don't believe that it's the proper role of the United States Senate to enact a federal marriage amendment. There are others who believe that it is. I believe it's the proper prerogative of the states.
All right. Julie Carey has the next question for Senator Warner.
Senator Warner, why did Congress shirk its constitutional duties and leave town to campaign without voting to authorize use of force against ISIS? Your own colleague, Senator Tim Kaine, has said, quote, you don't ask people to sacrifice their lives until the nation has debated and committed to the mission. Is he wrong about that?
No, I agree with Senator Kaine. I think Congress should be called back into session and debate this issue thoroughly. Because I believe, as Senator Kaine, I think I strongly support his leadership on this issue. I'm not sure I fully agree with the authorization of force that he has put forward, but that is part of the process that will be fully debated in front of the Foreign Relations Committee, amended and dealt with. I do believe, as sitting on the Intelligence Committee, that ISIL is a real threat to our country. And this is an area where, much to, well, my opponent will make charges of supporting Obama on every policy, this is where I differ with the president. I believe that we need a more forceful response against Syria and Iraq. I think it is very important that we also, I've been calling since early March, for stronger actions against Mr. Putin and Russia. Without American leadership, as we've seen, there is very little that goes on in the world, in a world that's very dangerous. Now, I will say the president, I think, has done 2 things on this issue that are important. One is he's pushed out the Maliki government because it was important that if we were going to come in and be supportive in Iraq, we've got to have a government that is inclusive of all factions. Unfortunately, the Maliki government was supported by both Bush and Obama policies. And he's building now the kind of coalition that includes Arab and Muslim nations, as well as Europeans and others, because this needs to be a fight that's not just American. It needs to be the civilized world against these terrorists.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Mr. Gillespie, you can respond.
I agree with Senator Kaine. There should be congressional authorization for the airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. I believe that that would be in the best interest of our country, and I think it would send a strong signal. As senator, if I were senator, I would support that. I think it would be a healthy debate to have on the floor of the United States Senate. I think it's required by the Constitution. And I believe it would send a much stronger signal to our potential allies and to our enemies that the United States is committed to this effort. One of the concerns I have is that I think there may be some fears that the United States is not committed long-term to this effort, and that causes consternation, I believe, among some of our potential allies. I also think we need to be stronger as a military, and unfortunately, Senator Warner has voted to cut nearly $1 trillion out of our military budget. We are now going to have a Navy that is smaller than World War I levels and an Army smaller than World War II levels. We need to have, according to the Pentagon, 306 ships to meet our national security needs. We're at about 282 on our way to 260 because of these defense cuts. That includes $486 billion in terms of the Budget Control Act, and then another $500 billion in sequestration. As a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and again, I will seek to serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee, I would work to replace those sequestration cuts, to repeal them, and to make sure that we are more secure as a country and that we make our military the proper priority it should be.
Senator Warner, you can respond. We've had this sequestration for quite some time now.
Well, listen, I have been against sequestration since its onset. I called it stupidity on steroids. And I find it curious that my opponent, who said he would not have voted, my understanding, again for the Budget Control Act that was supported by the majority of the delegation, Democrat and Republican in Virginia, John McCain, the Speaker, because the alternative was defaulting on our nation's debt that could have thrown us into economic turmoil. But no one has been a stronger advocate against sequestration. Matter of fact, I laid out, again, unlike my opponent, with specificity, and took arrows from both the left and the right on this in terms of a comprehensive plan for entitlement reform and tax reform that would have avoided sequestration. And matter of fact, I voted actually for both the Republican plan and the Democratic plan that would have replaced sequestration. And frankly, I was proud to receive the Navy's highest civilian honor, the Public Citizen Service Award, because of my efforts to try to roll back sequestration.
Right. Thank you, Senator. But for both of you, just very quickly, if you can answer this in 20 seconds, was the President right to rule out combat troops in this war against ISIS in Syria? Senator Warner?
I think he was not. I think he should not have ruled out boots on the ground.
So you're open to it?
Listen, I think we have to leave all our military options on the ground. Now, again, I am not supportive at this moment of re-intervening in a major way in Iraq, but I don't think you draw red lines that you may have to back up from.
Mr. Gillespie.
No, I don't believe you should take options off the table and signal to your allies or your enemies what you're prepared to do or not prepared to do. And again, as the Senator said, no one is recommending combat troops there right now. And saying that you're not taking it, you're not taking it off the table is not the same thing as saying that we should insert them. But you should not take them off the table as an option.
Thank you both. Aaron has the next question for Mr. Gillespie.
This question really is to both of you. Mr. Gillespie, you say that Senator Warner has voted 97% of the time for President Obama's agenda. Senator Warner, you've pointed out Mr. Gillespie's work heading up the Republican National Committee, working with the George W. Bush White House, and in helping in the Mitt Romney presidential campaign. And I'll start with Mr. Gillespie. Can you name a specific example of you standing up to your party? And Senator Warner, the same question to you, a specific example of standing up to the party. Mr. Gillespie.
Yeah, there are differences I have with, and again, when you're not in the White House, my party doesn't have one, thing to stand up to right now, but I will share with you some things where I think I'm probably at odds with some members of my party, and that is I believe that in the early 90s, when Congress passed mandatory minimum sentences in the U.S. Congress, that we swung too far, and that I believe that we need to revisit those, and in particular for nonviolent offenders, and allow more discretion for judges and, frankly, more discretion for the states to make determinations in terms of what are the proper sentencing guidelines for these things. I think we went overboard in terms of federal sentencing, mandatory minimum sentences. I'm someone who believes in redemption and in reconciliation, and I also believe that we need to look at the prospect of banning the box in terms of checking after you served your time and you have paid your price, and in terms of time in prison for certain crimes and for certain jobs. I don't think you should be required to check the box as a felon, which only increases recidivism. And I think if people have paid their debt to society, society needs to welcome them back into society and make it easier for them to come back into society if, again, for certain crimes and for certain positions.
Senator Warner, same thing.
I appreciate you asking that question, because my opponent's whole campaign has been pretty much based on this bogus charge, the 97% charge. I mean, independent political analysts have called it both misleading and not reflective of my record. The National Journal, which does a review of all the votes, not just a subsection, ranks me right in the sensible center. And your question, Aaron, where have I stood up against my party? Well, let me go through a list. I support drilling off the coast of Virginia, as long as we get a share of the royalties, but I support that. I support the Keystone Pipeline. Matter of fact, I've even been protested against in Harrisonburg because of that support. I've stood up repeatedly against the president on his foreign policy choices, both around, as we've talked about with ISIL, but also in terms of being stronger against Putin and Russia, start calling early in March for these kind of stronger opposition to his activities in Ukraine and around Europe. You know, and it's that reason that Virginians know my record. It's that reason why, again, in this campaign, I'm so proud to have the support of more former Republican legislators than when I ran the first time. If his claim had merit, I don't think that would be the case. What it is, though, is the kind of political soundbite attack charge that comes from somebody who spent their career as a partisan operative.
Mr. Gillespie, you want to respond to the 97%?
Well, actually, a number of things. First of all, the independent fact checker, which I don't always agree with, but PolitiFact rated the rating that Senator Warner votes with President Obama 97% of the time. True. Secondly, Senator Warner's press releases are very bipartisan, but his floor votes are very party line. And so let's take, for example, the Keystone XL pipeline, which we just heard he said again that he supports. And yet, on 2 different occasions on the Senate floor, when there was an opportunity to move forward with the Keystone XL pipeline, Senator Warner voted to block that from moving forward. When there was an opportunity to lift the moratorium off of drilling off of our deep sea coast, a bipartisan amendment, there was bipartisan support for it, as there was bipartisan support for the Keystone XL pipeline, Senator Warner voted against it. In both those instances, by the way, former Democratic Senator from Virginia, Jim Webb, voted for those amendments, voted with the bipartisan side, while Senator Warner sided with his leadership. And the fact is, one of the reasons he takes arrows from both sides is because he says one thing, but then votes another way, and that will get you arrows from both sides. Let me follow up on this
with both of you, because the fact of the matter is, Senator Warner, you have these votes that are party line. Why haven't you fought the party leadership? And then question to you, Mr. Gillespie, we haven't seen many Republicans fight Mitch McConnell either. I mean, this is sort of the Senate. Are you guys all hostages of the leadership?
Well, Ed,
are you not your own leader?
Chuck, what Ed doesn't tell you is that the analysis of those votes were mostly procedural votes. They're mostly confirmation votes. You know, and what he didn't say as well is when I voted against offshore drilling was because there was no proceeds coming back to Virginia. I've been very clear. I've had this legislation for 6 years. If we're going to go off the coast of Virginia, Virginia ought to get the same kind of royalty stream that Louisiana gets. Absolutely consistent. On Keystone, I believe we ought to wait till we got the science through. When the science and the EPA came back and said, let's build it, let's make sure that we export this kind of oil as well as natural gas, which would actually free up Europe's dependence on Russian oil and gas. These are all things where I think we can make changes and, frankly, strengthen America.
Mr. Gillespie, how do you stop the, basically, leadership stranglehold on making the Senate work?
Yeah, well, first of all, I will have a very simple test for every vote I cast as senator. And that is this: will this bill ease the squeeze on hardworking Virginians and make it easier for the unemployed to find work? And if it doesn't, I won't vote for it. I don't care what any White House says of either party. I don't care what any Senate leader says of either party. If it doesn't ease the squeeze on hardworking Virginians, I will fight against it, and I will promote policies that do, my 5-point agenda for economic growth. Now, there are actual votes that make up this 97% statistics. Let's look at some of them. Senator Warner voted for the failed stimulus, $1 trillion in wasted money. He voted for the excessive regulations in the Dodd-Frank bill that are making it hard for small businesses to get capital and get loans. He voted for $7 trillion in new debt and nearly $1 trillion in tax increases. He has not opposed a single nominee from this president during his entire time in the Senate. And of course, last but not least, he voted for the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, after telling us he would never vote for a health care reform bill that would be losing our insurance if we wanted to keep it. Let
me pause there. Karen Tumulty has the next question.
Well, that's a segue into this question.
Yes,
in
it
fact,
is.
Senator Warner, as Mr. Gillespie noted in his opening statement, and as my own newspaper, The Washington Post, has reported, As many as 250,000 Virginians are going to have to give up their current health insurance policies as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Now, I realize your campaign has disputed the exact figure, but at a minimum, thousands and thousands of Virginians are going to have to give up their current health insurance policies, in many cases, policies they like. So what do you say to those Virginians?
Well, Karen, thank you. What I hear constantly from Virginians is they want us to fix health care. I remind them of the fact that 49 years ago, when Congress passed Medicare, they didn't get it fully right at first, and they actually had to come back and fix it. I hear that Virginians actually want to keep parts of the ACA. They want to keep the fact that people with pre-existing conditions can get insurance. They want to make sure that women are not charged more than men. They like the fact that we can keep our kids on our policies till we're 26 years old. Now, my opponent's charge and this figure of 250,000, actually, the head of the Insurance Association of Virginia said that number was completely made up. And his attack has been called by the same PolitiFact simply false. Now, I do think people in the individual market ought to be able to keep their health care for 3 years, the way they do in North Carolina. Matter of fact, this has now been moved to a state issue, and there is a bipartisan bill before the General Assembly that would allow Virginians to have the same right as North Carolinians. I hope Ed would lobby for that. But I've gone further than that. I've also said where else I would change the ACA. I've laid out, not with sound bites, but specifics on a cheaper option, a copper plan. I've laid out specific legislation on how we'd roll back some of the regulatory overburden. I've even said, let's go ahead and put in place the ability for insurance companies, as long as there are consumer protections, to sell products across state lines. We need to fix this problem, not simply relitigate it.
Mr. Gillespie.
Yeah, the fact is that we can have reforms that address concerns about pre-existing conditions that make health care more affordable. I'm going to put forward a positive alternative of my own on Friday and talk about refundable tax credits, for example, and protections on pre-existing conditions. But the 250,000 figure came out in a Senate hearing in the state Senate. And you don't have to go far in the Commonwealth to find someone who has had their insurance canceled and lost their doctor as a result of Senator Warner's support for the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And one of those people is with me here tonight, Linda from Chesapeake. I met about a month ago. She told me about her rare degenerative eye disease, going blind in her right eye. And she has an eye care specialist who was very important to her and found out last year that her plan was canceled because of the Affordable Care Act. She and her husband went online. They found another plan that conformed to the Affordable Care Act, and they got it even though it had higher out-of-pocket expenses, higher deductibles, higher premiums, but it had this eye doctor in the plan, so they signed up for it. And she went in for her next visit, and they submitted the bill. And yes, the doctor is in the plan, but they find out only for emergency services, not for chronic care. And Linda and her husband now are paying out of pocket, and they're taking a huge hit, just like the woman I met in Danville. She and her husband both work. She carries the insurance. She's just been notified that her health insurance premiums are going to go up $600 per month as a result of Obamacare.
Time, Senator Warner, and in your response, where are all these fix-it bills? Because I've heard Democrats talk about it. Where's Harry Reid?
They have been filed. I'm happy to have
there are no votes on them? Why isn't Harry Reid introduced votes on them?
One of the things I think we need to do in the Senate is actually vote on amendments and have a more open process. I think both sets of leadership need to move on that. And there are a group of us, I think, that are going to take that on. But let's go to the question again, Karen. The 250,000 number, it wasn't my questioning. It was actually the head of the Insurance Association. Yes, it was cited by an elected official, but the head of the Insurance Association said the number was made up. And yes, there are ways we can fix that. Other states have for at least 3 years to keep on the individual policy, keep the plans you like. We ought to do that in Virginia. And again, it's in the General Assembly right now. I hope Ed would join me and lobby for it. But what I also hope to hear is Ed has been promising his own health care plan since January. It's now 28 days before the election. We still have no plan, no details. I've laid out ways to fix Obamacare. What we've heard from my opponent is sound bites.
Thank you, Senator. Julie, you have the next question.
Mr. Gillespie, at an earlier debate, you surprised some people when you said that you thought contraceptive pills should be offered without a prescription. You put it behind the counter like Sudafed, but unlike Sudafed, birth control pills aren't really one size fits all. Some types can be dangerous to women with certain health conditions. So I'd like to know exactly which of the 24 brands of contraceptives do you think should be available without prescription, and why do you think that would be safe for women?
Well, Julie, that's not a determination I made. That's a determination that the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has made. And they're the ones who recommended that there is no longer a medically necessary reason for oral contraceptives, the pill, to be a prescription drug. And they should be available without prescription over the counter. My point was, I think for adult women, behind the counter would be the appropriate step. But they, having them available without prescription would make the pill more affordable, more accessible, more easily obtainable for women, would bring the cost down. And I'm not the one to determine, what is the right ones to, make over the counter versus prescription. That's for the FDA and for the American College of OBGYNs and others to recommend. But if they're recommending it, it seems to me that that is something where we should be able to find bipartisan support. That would be something that women want, doctors recommend, pharmacists would like, and to me it makes a lot of sense, and it would remove this issue from politics and from these constitutional questions relative to religious liberty and religious freedom, and I think that would be a good thing for the country as well as a good thing for women.
Senator Warner.
On this issue, there are stark differences in terms of who trusts the women of Virginia. What my opponent doesn't tell you about his plan, which is really a gimmick that is being used in a number of states, is that the existing law right now says for women on birth control, there's no copay. His plan, or gimmick, would actually charge on average, same groups have validated this, about $600 out of pocket for women that currently they have no copayment. His plan as well does nothing in terms of other forms of birth control. And that's because on this issue, we've had just a very different approach. I trust women to make these kind of decisions with their doctor, and I don't think government should interfere. My opponent cheered the Hobby Lobby decision, which said private sector employers ought to decide what kind of health care women should get. He's been supported by the major anti-choice groups around the country. He wouldn't answer in the last debate about whether he wants to overturn Roe v. Wade. These groups that support him clearly want to overturn Roe v. Wade. And he's not spoken up at all in terms of some of his supporters who have put forward these invasive ultrasound legislation that all of us, particularly the business community, all stood up and said, we don't like Virginia being the subject of ridicule on late night shows, but yet he hasn't stood up and spoke out against that. So on this issue, again, I look forward to the women of Virginia making their decision come November 4th.
Mr. Gillespie, you get a minute
What's
to respond.
interesting is that the reason that non-prescription birth control and other non-prescription drugs are not covered is because that is the rule in Obamacare. That's the rule that you voted for that said that these plans cannot, I understand, but my point is if you replaced Obamacare with market-oriented reforms, people could purchase the insurance of their choice. And many women would purchase plans that would cover over-the-counter prescription or over-the-counter non-prescription birth control pills. And talk about having faith in the women of Virginia. I have faith in the women of Virginia to make those determinations of what is the best plan and policy for them and their medical needs. Not to have a set prescription or proscription in terms of what plans you cannot buy, and we will tell you from the federal government what you can and cannot buy. And your response to improving the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is to add a fourth plan that you will tell the women of Virginia what they can and cannot buy. And by the way, the women of Virginia, as I mentioned, are seeing their health insurance premiums skyrocket and their out-of-pocket expenses go up as a result of your vote for Obamacare.
We are going to hit the pause button here. Going to put in a brief commercial break, probably paid for by the campaigns. I'm half joking. We want to remind you that the debate is streaming live on NBCWashington.com. Join us for a Google Hangout after the debate. We'll be right back with many more questions: economy, immigration, congressional dysfunction, all coming up after the break. And we are back live here in McLean, Virginia, with the two candidates, four major party candidates for the U.S. Senate here in the Commonwealth. Senator Warner, let me start with you. A recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll found a majority of Americans believing that the political outcome won't change Washington, no matter if the Democrats control the Senate or if the Republicans control the Senate. As governor, you talked about all these bipartisan deals you were able to accomplish. As a U.S. Senator, bipartisanship is a near impossibility, it seems. Number one, why is that? And why do you want another term if you haven't been able to be bipartisan?
Because I'm just not willing to accept the notion that somehow in America we can't fix problems. My whole career in business and in politics has been, how do you fix things? And do I get frustrated with what's going on in Congress? Yes, I haven't found anybody that's part of the 8% that Congress thinks they're doing a good job. But what it requires is people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and get things done and be bipartisan. And I'm proud of my record there. Again, I think the record speaks for itself. What we could do to change? Well, one of the things, there was a court decision today that said throughout Virginia's congressional districts, we ought to do independent redistricting reform. That would be a giant step forward in terms of restoring faith. We ought to also get rid of our campaign finance rules, which currently, the Citizens United case, which my opponent supports, I think the Supreme Court got it wrong. I think we ought to, there's a super PAC that supports my opponent, a super PAC that supports me. I think we ought to get rid of all super PACs and all outside money. Matter of fact, I'd be willing tonight, Ed, to say from the last 28 days, let's just have this race between you and me and no outside influences. That would be a step in the right direction.
Do I get to spend $1.4 million on an outside group like you've spent against me?
You have a super PAC. You have a super PAC. I think we ought to get rid of all the super PACs. I think we ought to make sure this is about campaigns between the two of us, not outside money. Let's get rid of that outside money. But at the end of the day, you've got to have folks who are willing to check their Democrat and Republican hats. And we built a broad-based coalition on debt and deficit that's going to have to come back, sequestration. And I hope if I get rehired, I'll be able to continue.
Mr. Gillespie, do you accept by the way, do you accept the notion that Washington's broken?
Well, I have to point out, this is classic, that let's not have any outside group spending money when your super PAC has spent $1.4 million attacking me over that. Now we're going to call it quits?
Well. You had the granddaddy of all
I haven't had a penny. I haven't had a penny spent, but that doesn't matter. Let me talk about I just find it humorous. The bigger thing is, look, I believe we can get things done. And one of the reasons I want to go to Washington is because I do, as I said in my opening statement, I want to see future generations and other families see the same blessings of liberty that I have seen in my family. My grandfather was an immigrant from Ireland. He was a janitor. My father came here to this country, God rest his soul, 85 years ago today. And I got to grow up to be the counselor to the President of the United States of America. What a country. From immigrant janitor to West Wing of the White House in 2 generations' time. And we're losing that. We're losing that. And it doesn't, most Americans today don't believe that we are a country where the next generation can do better than the generation that came before us. That does not have to be our past. That must be our future, and it can be with the right policies. And I just believe if I can get there, I will fight for those things every day. I'll work across party lines. I have a very simple test, and I've shared with you what it is. And if Democrats are for it, for easing the bills that ease the squeeze on hardworking Americans as well as hardworking Virginians, I'll work with them. And we can get stuff done. And I do agree with you, Mark. And Mitch McConnell has said, and I take him at his word, that he will open up the Senate floor to amendments. And that would be a healthy thing for the process. And I would certainly support that. If when we're in the majority, I will make sure Democrats have amendments in the minority.
You get a response if you'd like on this one.
What I didn't hear from my opponent in that response, and I think Ed's family's got a great story. I'm proud of my story as well. And I'm proud of the stories that Virginians can all tell in their own families of being able to overcome odds. And it's why I'm still in public service, because everybody got to get that fair shot. But I also worry as well, and part of my worry is because we've got such partisan gridlock. I've laid out specific solutions. Independent redistricting reform. Let's change our campaign finance rules so that we don't have all this outside money. Let's end up freeing up the Senate process. Ed and I agree on that. But what is different is his whole career has been as a partisan political operative. He says, elect me, and then I'm going to suddenly be bipartisan. For better or for worse, you've got my record. You've got my record as governor where we got things done. And I go back, check my legislation. Every major piece of legislation I work on, I start with a Republican partner. And when we come back, The question around getting our balance sheet right, and that's where I've probably taken the most arrows, is going to be front and center. And we've got to go back to a Simpson-Bowles type report, or Simpson-Bowles type solution to get it done.
Very quickly to both of you. Is Harry, to you, Senator Warner, is Harry Reid the best person to lead the Senate Democrats, yes or no?
Listen, I think we could perhaps do better in both parties moving forward.
I take that as a no. Mr. Gillespie, is that Mitch McConnell the best candidate the Republicans can have to lead the Senate majority if Republicans win it?
Well, I'm assuming that Mitch McConnell is going to get, reelected in Kentucky, and that he's the current leader, and he would
you'll
rise
support
to
him
leadership.
if you get
and
elected.
So
he's the best
candidate?
candidate?
A contest or anything? No, I would,
yes or no?
I like Mitch McConnell, and
Okay.
I take him at his word when he says that he will open up the Senate floor to amendments, and that would be good for the process. There have been 9 amendments allowed by Democrats and 8 by Republicans over the past 2 years.
Karen's got the next question.
Mr. Gillespie, a moment ago you spoke quite passionately about your own family story as an example of the kind of opportunity this country has offered immigrants. Back in April, Mark Herring, the Attorney General of Virginia, declared that undocumented qualified immigrants who grew up in Virginia, who graduated from high school in the Commonwealth, could qualify for in-state tuition at universities and colleges in Virginia. Do you agree with this policy?
I understand it. It's a state policy. I'm running for the United States Senate, and in terms of the notion of granting amnesty at a federal level for people who are here illegally, I think that needs to be hashed out through a legislative process. And I do not believe that we should confer citizenship on people who are here by virtue of having broken our laws. At the same time, I don't believe that we are going to deport 10 to 12 million people, and I think that we should have a means by which we can issue fresh visas to people who are here if they have not violated any other laws besides the law, our immigration law, if they pay back taxes, if they demonstrate self-sufficiency, which has always been a hallmark of our immigration system. But I believe we have to do this through the legislative process. And I also believe, by the way, that starts with securing our border. And the fact that we have a porous southern border today is not just an immigration concern. It is a national security concern with the growing threat of ISIS or ISIL, and it is a public health threat and a public safety threat with the growing concerns about Ebola. And so I believe we need to have a legislative approach that begins with securing our borders. The things that we do, by the way, to keep people from coming here illegally will allow us to welcome people here legally, people like my father, in a rational system. And then with visa reforms that address H-1B visas and others as well. But also 40% of people who are here illegally today are here by overstaying a visa. We can fix that, and that would allow us to have fresh visas for the people who are here now.
Senator Warner, you get a 90-second response.
I think we would agree our immigration system is broken. It needs to be fixed. The thing is, the Senate actually put together a bipartisan plan that would do that. It took first that we've got to increase border security. It more than doubles border security. It takes on the issue, which I've worked on, actually again in a bipartisan way with Senator Moran from Kansas, how we deal with the question about H-1B visas. How do we make sure we have those tech workers that graduate from George Mason or Virginia Tech? They don't have to go home. They simply have to go to Canada for those high-paying jobs now because they fixed their immigration system. It took on as well the question of guest workers. It took on as well the question of what do you do with the undocumented in terms of back taxes, learning English, a whole series of other items. Remarkable thing, this bill was supported by 68 senators, supported by business, labor, and faith groups. Was it perfect? Maybe not, but we got nothing back from the House. And what I find curious is, back when this bill was being debated, my opponent Ed wrote and said that this bill was both good policy and good politics. Now he said on the campaign trail that he's against the comprehensive Senate immigration reform bill. And I just wonder, what's changed? Is the policy changed or the politics changed?
Well,
nothing's changed on my end.
Mr. Gillespie, you have a minute.
Nothing's changed on my end. And as you know, PolitiFact, which you cited earlier, looked at my position on immigration reform and said it's been entirely consistent, and it has been. I said at the time the Senate bill was moving through that it needed to have tougher border security provisions. And I do believe that we need to secure our border. And unfortunately, when there was an opportunity to do that, again, an amendment on the Senate floor to secure our southern border with a fence in 2009, would have it secured by December of 2010. 21 Democrats voted for that amendment, including former Democratic Senator from Virginia, Jim Webb. But that bipartisan amendment, Senator Warner voted with Harry Reid against it. We also had just a vote last month in which there was a vote that said that after the election, because of what the president said in terms of taking unilateral action to make executive decisions as he's done in the past, that there would not be the funding for them to do that and to block the president from taking executive action, require legislation to make any changes to immigration status. And 5 Democrats voted for that. It failed 50-50, and Senator Warner voted against it.
Mr. Gillespie, just very quick, would you have voted for the Gang of 8 bill?
I would not vote for the
Gang
of 8 bill today. I was not in the Senate at the time, but I would not vote for the Gang of 8 bill today. The Gang of 8 bill is dead. And I think it is clear that we need to secure our border first. And there's no doubt about that. No policy is going to take place in the United States Senate or the United States House without securing our border first. And when we had the opportunity to do that in 2009, Senator Warner voted against the amendment.
Senator, I want to ask you, do you support the president acting unilaterally on immigration if there is no bill to you by the end of the year?
Listen, I don't know what the president is planning on doing. I'm not going to comment. I do think it.
Do you think he should act unilaterally?
I think this is better solved legislatively. But I'm not going to make a position on what the president, which I don't know what he's going to do or even proposing to do.
Well, you know he's going to act unilaterally.
But listen, I think this is better solved legislatively. But let's go back to the question. Ed says he's for immigration reform. The border security in the immigration bill more than doubled our current border security. It had this broad breadth of support. If you're not willing to get behind something that has 68 senators, and tonight he said he's not for comprehensive immigration
both got
reform.
an extra 30 on that, which I knew you might want on immigration. Aaron's got the next question on the economy.
Senator Warner, as I think a lot of people here in this room know, the economy here in Northern Virginia pretty much humming along at this point. But in places like Danville and Lynchburg, the unemployment rate is noticeably higher than the statewide average right now. You've been either a governor or a senator for much of the last decade in Virginia. Why haven't you been able to do more to close the divide between the economic and geographical have and have-nots in Virginia?
Well, Aaron, one of the things I'm proud of is that Virginia has actually consistently done better than national averages on unemployment. You know, there's nothing more important than having a job in terms of, for a family, in terms of self-worth. And everything in my career has been about creating jobs in the private sector. As governor, again, when we were recognized best managed state, best state for business, that's how you create jobs, making a healthy business climate. And there's been some good news recently in Martinsville and Henry County, because actually they added manufacturing jobs at a faster rate than almost any other community. And that's partially because we've had an explosive growth around energy, which I support all of the above energy policies, yes, including coal, because we've got to make sure that we can bring these manufacturing jobs back home. I've even got, again, I hate to keep coming back, bipartisan legislation that would provide incentives to bring jobs back home to America. And the way we're going to do that is having a tax code that supports it. But we're also going to need to do more of what I did as governor, where we brought down a company that's had a lot of presence here in Northern Virginia, CGI, maybe my best day as governor, when we brought close to 700 high-tech jobs to Russell County in Southwest Virginia, because we put the incentives and we put the package together. Now, if we're going to continue that, we've got to do a series of things. I know that my time's running out. We've got to continue to expand broadband all across Virginia. I've been supportive of that. Changed, again, part of the agriculture bill to make sure the monies were going to actually underserved areas. We've got to make sure that we consolidate a lot of our workforce training programs. Again, got some suggestions there. But job creation is key to moving forward, and I will match my record, frankly, on that one, and not only against my opponent, but against other folks.
Mr. Gillespie, you get 90 seconds on this.
Well, Mark Warner just talked about his time very extensively as Governor Warner. But Governor Warner wouldn't recognize Senator Warner today and the votes that he has cast in the United States Senate for job-killing policy after job-killing policy. And when you look at Virginia right now, our unemployment rate has been climbing. Actually, it's climbed 0.7 of a percentage point over the past 4 months. And as I mentioned, since the senator took office, for every net job we've created here in the Commonwealth, 2 Virginians have gone on food stamps. Now, I believe that we need to make it easier for people to get off of food stamps and into good-paying full-time jobs. And one of the worst things about the senator's policies, I believe, when you look at Obamacare, when you look at the regulations, when you look at, and he has not opposed the EPA rule from this administration, which would result in a third to 50% of our coal-fired plants being closed in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which would mean even more lost jobs for our coal miners, but also would mean higher prices for our electric bills and for price at the gas at the pump, which has already doubled since the senator took office. I want to create jobs, raise take-home pay, lift people out of poverty, hold down health care costs. And my agenda, which starts with replacing Obamacare, has tax and regulatory relief, unleashing American energy, would do those things. And that's important because we know there's not just economic value in labor, there is human dignity in work. And we need more of our fellow Virginians to have that dignity, and I will fight every day to make sure that they do.
Senator Warner, in your response, because you brought up cap and trade, he brought up cap and trade, so very quickly, you 4 months ago said you were reviewing the EPA rules. Where are you on that?
And Chuck, what I did was I joined with 51 senators and said, let's extend the comment period so we can get the facts right.
So you're not yet supportive?
So we can get the facts right.
Yet.
Let's let the science dictate. What I differ from my opponent, though, and I'd like to actually get my full response in here, is that, you know, on energy, I'm for all the above, including coal, including nuclear, including natural gas. But where we differ again is I recognize there's also a serious challenge around climate change. I'd like to take Ed down to Norfolk, take you down to Norfolk and see the rising sea levels that's costing the Navy millions of dollars to spend on raising the piers because of the effect of rising sea levels. He refuses to acknowledge that. On his energy policy, he lobbied against fuel efficiency standards, and he was a lobbyist for Enron. I'm not sure that's the approach that we need going forward. And I would simply add, let me add, he listed off all these charges. His economic policies that he championed were 2 wars on a credit card, a tax cut that we couldn't afford, an entitlement program that wasn't paid for, that drove our country into the fiscal ditch. If that's your EG squared plan, I'm not sure the country can afford it again.
Time, Senator. Mr. Gillespie, he brought up climate change. Man-made?
I believe there's ample evidence that supports that there is climate change occurring and that man contributes to it. I also believe that closing a third to 50% of our coal-fired plants with these rules, which Senator Warner took a very tough stance to say we should extend the comment period past the election. I can tell you right now, I don't think we should close a third to 50% of our coal-fired plants. And if we do, we're going to force more production to countries like China, India, and Indonesia that have less stringent air quality standards than we do. And so if you care about clean air and reducing emissions, then the last thing you want to do is push them to places like that.
It was the most of the Republicans who asked to extend the comment period.
Time to both of you guys. I've got about 3 or 4 lightning round questions, we're calling them here. Some of them yes or no, so don't try to take more than 30 seconds. Mr. Gillespie, I'll start with you. Model Supreme Court Justice.
Well, I had the real privilege and honor to help guide through confirmation both Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito. So I have, I know them both personally, and I admire them both immensely. And I think they're very, they do their job.
You're not going to pick one, huh?
Well, it'd be tough. I mean, like I said, I helped to get them both confirmed.
Right. Senator Warner, your model Supreme Court Justice.
On the current court?
Yes.
I think Justice Ginsburg does a good job.
What's your philosophy when it comes?
My philosophy is, and I've had the opportunity to vote on Supreme Court nominees, I think you need to look at their judicial temperance, their ability to stay open, and I think that the opportunities I've had to vote on the nominees that have been put forward, I think met that criteria.
All right. Let me ask you, this is for both of you, but it's worded differently. Senator Warner, what is President Obama's biggest shortcoming? And Mr. Gillespie, if you get elected to the U.S. Senate, what do you look forward to actually, that President Obama supports, that you look forward to working with him on? Senator, you first.
Well, I really differ greatly with the President on the not pushing more to get our balance sheet in order. We're $17 trillion in debt. It goes up $3 billion a night. Interest rates go up 1%. It's going to add $120 billion just in additional interest payments. And the only way this is going to get solved is if we have folks who are willing to chuck their Democrat and Republican hats, which I have done on this issue, and say we've got to do entitlement reform and tax reform. And I have been disappointed the President didn't take the Simpson-Bowles plan and push it harder.
Mr. Gillespie, what with the President that he supports that you look forward to working with him on?
Well, look, we're obviously in a very dangerous time, and we face very serious threats. And I did serve as counselor to the President of the United States at a time of war, and I've been there in the Oval Office when the Commander-in-Chief has gotten reports of casualties and deaths with our brave men and women serving us in the field. And I would want to work with him to make sure that he is doing and gets the support he needs to prevail in the defeat of ISIS and ISIL. And, you know, frankly, I pray for him in that regard.
All right, last question, 30 seconds to both of you. Mr. Gillespie, I'll start with you. What is the job of a U.S. Senator?
I believe the job of the U.S. Senator is to work every day. In my estimation, it's to work every day to pass and enact policies that make sure that we can keep the American dream alive, that we can make sure that, as I said, that future families and other generations can have the same blessings of liberty that I've seen in my lifetime. And I think it's to be an effective advocate for the people, in our case, of our Commonwealth. And as you know, I have been on the campaign trail and met so many Virginians. I would fight every day for the people I've met along the trail.
Senator, what is the job description?
I think it's to solve problems, to fix problems. And that's what I've done in my business career. That's what I've done as governor. That's what I'm trying to do as senator. Is it hard sometimes? Amen. But I would never give in to the kind of cynicism that says that America is not the greatest country in the world and that we can't still fix big problems. The difference between Ed and I at our core is that he sees every problem through the lens of Republican versus Democrat. Right. I see every problem in the lens of what we can do to move America forward, and that means you got to be bipartisan.
All right. Thank you to both of you. That concludes our questions. And now, Mr. Gillespie, you have a 1-minute closing statement, followed by Senator Warner.
Well, thank you, Chuck, and thank you to the panel, and thank you to everyone who's here today. It was a pleasure to talk about my ideas and my solutions, my common sense solutions that I believe would get bipartisan support on the floor of the United States Senate and would help create jobs, raise take-home pay, lift people out of poverty, and hold down health care costs and reduce energy prices. That's why I was so proud today to get the endorsement of the National Federation of Independent Business, the champion of small businesses in America, and they understand that my agenda is the agenda that will create more opportunities for my fellow Virginians. Now, I'm getting a lot of support from a lot of Virginians, frankly, who supported Senator Warner in 2008 because they see that he's not the senator he said he would be, and they're supporting me and they like my agenda, and they realize that I will fight to create jobs, raise take-home pay, and lift people out of poverty. And you know, most Americans, as I said today, no longer believe we're a nation where the next generation can do better than the generation that came before us. That does not have to be our past. It must be our future, and it can be with the right policies, and those are my policies, and that's why I ask Virginians to vote for me on November 4th.
Thank you. Senator Warner.
You know, thank you, Chuck. And, you know, we've heard a lot of negative attacks from Ed tonight. I'm proud of the fact, actually, there's more former Republican legislators and others across the business community supporting me this year than when I first ran. But the difference between us is I'm actually a real optimist about America. See, I've been blessed to live the American dream. I've failed my first 2 businesses, but it didn't stop me from picking up and trying again. You know, in business, in government, in my whole life, I've tried to be a problem solver. And too often these days, we end up seeing the forces of negativism or political gridlock say no. And I just won't agree with that. I think more than ever we need people in Washington who are willing to roll up their sleeves and get things done. You know, America's the greatest country in the world. And we have to get back to the notion that in America, that when we see a problem, we come together and fix it, and then we move on to the next problem. That is the most quintessential aspect of America. And if you rehire me, that's what I'll do. Thank you, and
all right.
Go Nats.
Thank you to the candidates. Go Nats. That's a good side. Thank you to the candidates. Thank you to the panelists. Of course, thank you to the Fairfax Chamber.